G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for coming along. This is session 19, book of Jeremiah. In the last session, we finished off the first part of chapter 29, where Jeremiah wrote letters to the captives in Babylon. He's writing after the second deportation in 597 BC. And he's writing to all the captives who were taken away from Jerusalem to Babylon. And he's telling them to go and to build homes, plant gardens, settle down. You're going to be there for 70 years. And he says to live peacefully in the land. He also warns them not to be deceived by any of the false prophets, because they are not speaking from God, because they prophesy falsely, and they are false prophets in Babylon amongst the Jewish people. He also tells them that after the 70 years of captivity, God will visit them and bring them back into the land. Then Jeremiah goes on to talk about the latter end, or the latter times, which is the prophetic future. And he talks about the fact that there's going to be a national regeneration sometime in the distant future. He says, "You shall seek me and find me," which means that there's a national regeneration. Then he says, "I'll bring you back to the place where I caused you to be carried away captive from." So this, he's talking about in the prophetic future, and this would have been the dispersion brought about during the Great Tribulation period. Now, getting back to Jerusalem and Babylon in his day, he speaks about the misery of those who are going to be left behind in Babylon. So those left in Judah, those left in Judah claimed that Jehovah has raised up prophets in Babylon, and they're saying it's only going to be 2 years and we'll be back in the lands. Everything will be nice and peaceful. So we knew that there were prophets in the land of Babylon. We had two godly prophets there. We had Daniel and Ezekiel, but there are also false prophets down there, and the people continue to listen to the false prophets. He writes to King Zedekiah and the people in Jerusalem, and he warns them that because they failed to listen to God through his servants, the prophets, and they continue listening to false prophets, because they failed to submit to Babylonian rule, which they're still rebelling against Babylonian rule, because they believe it's only going to last 2 years before Babylon collapses as an empire. Jeremiah tells them that Jerusalem will become an astonishment. It'll become a reproach among all the nations. He also goes on to tell them that those who went into captivity will be far better off, and they should not listen to the false prophets down in Babylon and continue rebelling against Babylon. So this is where we come up to today, where he now sends a message to Ahab and Zedekiah in chapter 29, verses 21 to 23. Back in Jeremiah 28, we had a message to a false prophet called Hananiah, who was in the land in Judah. In Jeremiah 29, we have a message to two false prophets in Babylon. Verse 21 gives us their names. "Thus says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, concerning Ahab, the son of Kaliah, and concerning Zedekiah, the son of Maaseiah, who prophesy a lie unto you in my name. Behold, I will deliver them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he shall slay them before your eyes." So Ahab, one of the false prophets, was the son of Kaliah. Zedekiah was the son of Maaseiah. So this is not the same as Zedekiah the king, because Zedekiah the king was the son of Josiah. Now, what is their sin? Their sin is the same as the sin of Hananiah. They prophesy a lie in the name of Jehovah. And because of this, judgment is coming. God would deliver them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, they're going to be killed by Nebuchadnezzar before the eyes of the Jewish captives. And the reason is that they prophesied the same early return as Hananiah. Hananiah said, it's only going to last 2 years and we'll all be back in the land happy. They prophesied also of an early return within that 2-year period. And this prophecy gave false hope to the captives who were in the land in Babylon. And because of this, the exiles disobeyed Jeremiah's orders and did not settle down in Babylon. And in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes, Ahab and Zedekiah were leading a revolt. It was an act of rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar's rule. So he killed them. And Nebuchadnezzar killed them by roasting them in fire. He seemed Nebuchadnezzar liked killing people with fire because, remember, he attempted to kill the three friends of Daniel with the same method. Now, according to verse 22, the fate of the two false prophets became the formula for cursing among the exiles. And of them shall be taken up a curse by all the captives of Judah that are in Babylon, saying, Jehovah make you like Zedekiah and like Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in fire. So it appears that Nebuchadnezzar's preferred method of executing his enemies was by fire, as we can also see in the book of Daniel. Now, this form of punishment was not limited to Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but was used in Babylon over a much longer period of time. And verse 23 provides a reason for this type of punishment. Because they have wrought folly in Israel and have committed adultery with their neighbors' wives and have spoken words in my name falsely, which I commanded them not. And I am he that knows and am witness, says Jehovah. Now, the Hebrew term for folly, where it says they have wrought folly, Hebrew term for folly is Nebalah, Nebalah. It means senselessness and disgrace. So by using this term, Jeremiah denotes there was some gross act of immorality. And if you look back into Genesis 34:7 and Deuteronomy 22:21 use the same way, this term folly, Nebalah. Now, Ahab and Zedekiah acted foolishly in Israel by committing adultery with their neighbors' wives and by proclaiming false prophecies. They were immoral, false prophets, and Jehovah himself served as a witness against them. Now we get a message to Shemaiah, and this is in verses 24 to 32. This is another false prophet who spread his lies among the Jewish captives in Babylon. Now in verse 24, it provides the name of this impostor, and concerning Shemaiah, the Nehelamite, you shall speak, saying. So this false prophet was Shemaiah, a man who apparently came from the town of Nehelam. As far as we know from the Bible and archaeology, there is no such place yet found or that is known as Nehelam. But we do know at this time if this place, we do not know if this place at this time existed. Nevertheless, it may not be a place, because Jeremiah might be, again, playing some word games here. Now, why do I say that? Well, because the term Nehelamite means a dreamer. Perhaps Jeremiah used this term because it was intended to be a bit of a pun on the word dreamer. Jeremiah refers to this Shemaiah as Shemaiah from dreamland. That's basically what he's saying. He receives his prophecies from his dreams. So this is quite probably Jeremiah's intent. Now, after Jeremiah sent the letter of the captivity back in verses 4 to 14, Shemaiah did not like what Jeremiah wrote. And this was earlier on in the chapter. And in verses 25 to 29, Shemaiah wrote his own letter, and he sent it to Jerusalem, since he himself happened to be in the captivity. Now, the recipients of his message are listed in verse 25. This is Shemaiah writing this. He says, "Thus speaks Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, because you have sent letters in your own name unto all the people that are at Jerusalem, and to Zephaniah the son of Messiah, the priest, and to all the priests, saying." So Shemaiah wrote in his own name, meaning that he did so without Jehovah's authority and approval. He addressed his letter to the citizens and the priests of Jerusalem. He also sent it to a specific priest by the name of Zephaniah, who we should not confuse with Zephaniah the prophet. Zephaniah the priest is also mentioned in 2 Kings 25:18-20, Jeremiah 21:1, Jeremiah 37:3, and Jeremiah 52:24-27. It's there on the slide. Now, according to these passages, his life ended rather tragically. Now, verse 26, this is Zephaniah, the prophet, Zephaniah the priest, sorry. Now, verses 26-28 summarize the content of Shemaiah's letter, with verse 26 describing his position. Jehovah has made you a priest in the stead of Jehoiada the priest, that there may be officers in the house of Jehovah. For every man that is mad and makes himself a prophet, that you should put him in the stocks and in the shackles. So Zephaniah was now priest instead of Jehoiada, as well as another priest by the name of Pashur. So both Zephaniah and Pashur were now priests, as well as, there were priests as well as overseers of the temple area. And as such, their job was to keep peace in the temple compound. Now, as the record of Pashur's service back in chapter 20 showed us, this priest was not keeping the peace in the right way, because Jeremiah back in chapter 20 was not disturbing the peace, but he was bringing a message to facilitate peace. And either way, back in chapter 20, at this point, the man in charge of the temple compound was now Zephaniah as well as Pashur. So as overseer, he had authority. This is Zephaniah. He had authority over every man that is mad and makes himself a prophet. So in his letter to Jerusalem, Shemaiah was reminding Zephaniah of this responsibility. And he was basically charging Jeremiah with being such a madman and a person who had made himself a prophet. So Shemaiah is saying, listen, Zephaniah, you need to lock up this madman Jeremiah because he's made himself a prophet. Well, quite the opposite was true, because if you remember, Jeremiah had been appointed by God while Shemaiah appointed himself as prophet. It was Shemaiah himself who should have been put in stocks and in shackles, not Jeremiah. In verse 27, Shemaiah asked why Zephaniah was not fulfilling his role as overseer of the temple compound. Now, therefore, why have you not rebuked Jeremiah of Anathoth, who makes himself a prophet to you? Again, Shemaiah is making the implication here that Jeremiah had made himself a prophet, but in actual fact, Jeremiah had done no such thing. Remember, he was very reluctant to take up his calling as a prophet. He had lots of excuses. Now, the reason that Jeremiah should be rebuked, according to Shemaiah, is found in verse 28. Jeremiah sent letters to the captivity saying that it was going to be a long exile. For as much as he has sent unto us in Babylon, this is Shemaiah writing, saying the captivity is long, build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat of the fruit of them. So false prophets like Hananiah, Ahab, Zedekiah, and Shemaiah did not agree with Jeremiah when he said that the captivity would last for 70 years. And Zephaniah's response in verse 29, Zephaniah the priest read this letter in the ears of Jeremiah the prophet. That's all he did. He just read it so that Jeremiah could hear it. He didn't go beyond this response. Remember, the false prophets were prophesying, our captivity is only going to last 2 years, and then we'll be back into the land again. So Zephaniah's response to this letter in verse 29 was limited. He simply read it in the ears of Jeremiah the prophet. Other than making sure that Jeremiah was aware of the content of Shemaiah's letter, he didn't do anything else. In verse 30, then came the word of Jehovah unto Jeremiah, saying, in verse 31, the sin of Shemaiah is now spelled out. Send to all them of the captivity, saying, Thus says Jehovah concerning Shemaiah the Nehelamite, because that Shemaiah has prophesied unto you, and I sent him not, and he has caused you to trust in a lie. So first of all, we see here that Shemaiah, this is the sin of Shemaiah. First of all, he prophesied the captivity when God did not send him. He's a false prophet. And second, because of his false prophecy, he has caused the captivity to trust in a lie. Those are those who were taken into Babylon in 604, 605 BC and 597 BC. So they were the first two deportations. He caused them to trust that the captivity would be short and not 70 years long, as Jeremiah had predicted. And in verse 32, therefore, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will punish Shemaiah the Nehelamite and his seed. He shall not have a man to dwell among this people, neither shall he behold the good that I will do unto my people, says Jehovah, because he has spoken rebellion against Jehovah. That's what God is saying. In verse 32, Shemaiah is now under judgment. God will punish him and his seed so that he will not have a man to dwell among his people. So neither will Shemaiah live to see the good that God will do to the people. This means he will not see the end of the 70 years of captivity. He will die before the captivity ends. Not only is it true that Shemaiah will die before the end of the captivity, it is also true that he will have no descendants by the end of the captivity. The house of Shemaiah will die out totally within the 70 years of the captivity. And the punishment is, first of all, that God will punish Shemaiah and his seed. Shemaiah will not have a man to dwell among this people. Second, Shemaiah will not have a man to dwell among this people. Third, Shemaiah will not live to see the good that God will do to the people. He won't make it to the end of the captivity, and he won't have any descendants who will make it to the end of the captivity. The chapter now ends with the reasons for the judgment, because he has spoken rebellion against Jehovah. So the first thing we see here is that he's spoken rebellion. Second, this is always the nature of false prophecy. Whether it is a false prophecy in the name of a foreign god or in the name of Jehovah, false prophecy is always an act of rebellion. And furthermore, this act of rebellion brought about by these false prophecies also incites rebellion against the word of God amongst those who hear it, which makes it an even greater sin. Now we come into this section, which is the third part of Jeremiah's message to Judah. So far, most of the message has been very negative, but scattered amongst them were a few short segments that express some hope, such as back in Jeremiah 23, verses 1 to 8. Now, what follows now from chapter 30 to 33 is a series of chapters now marked by the promise of restoration. And there are passages within this section that highlights some negative aspects for the people, but most of the text is positive. Most of it is positive. That's why this section has come to be called the Book of Consolation. This is chapter 30 to 33 of Jeremiah. All four of these chapters have the hope for the future restoration of Israel in common. All the chapters will talk about that. However, there are variations in the focus of the different parts of this section. Chapter 30 to 31 provide a general overview of what that restoration will mean for the entire nation, Judah and Israel, while Jeremiah 32 to 33 deals more specifically with Judah and Jerusalem. So, okay, we're going to head into the Book of Consolation. We're going to first see the restoration of Israel and Judah in verses 1, chapter 30, verse 1, and chapter 31, verse 40. And here we see the superscription in chapter 30, verse 1 to 3. In verse 1, the word that came to Jeremiah from Jehovah. So a whole new section is now introduced. In verse 2, he is specifically commanded to write. Thus speaks Jehovah, the God of Israel, saying, write you all the words that I have spoken unto you in a book. The word in Hebrew, ketav lekah, literally means write for yourself. So part of Jeremiah, remember, part of Jeremiah's own personal anguish in chapters 2 to 29 was the constant negative messages he had to bring. You know, they used to say, oh, here comes the dooms boy. Here he comes again, bringing doom again. These messages that he had to bring constantly ate away at him, and he desired to preach something a little bit more positive. Now God is answering that desire in Jeremiah. Jehovah gives 4 chapters of positive message. He was told to write this down for his own personal benefit. He's to write it in a book. Again, the emphasis here is upon the words that God has spoken. In the original manuscripts, every word was inspired and without error. Every word we see here that I have spoken to you, he says. And once again, the emphasis is upon God speaking to Jeremiah. And these words are to be placed in an extensive book. Now, by mentioning the word book in verse 2, the situation here is that chapters 30 to 33 are a separate book. They are like a subunit within the book of Jeremiah. And as we went through Jeremiah 1 to 29, there's a basic tenor right throughout. And then Jeremiah 34 to 52 has the same basic tenor. However, Jeremiah 30 to 33 are different. They're different from everything before it and everything after it. And this is a very special segment within the book of Jeremiah itself. In verse 3, we have a summary of his prophecies. For lo, the days come, says Jehovah, that I will turn again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, says Jehovah, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Good news. Where he says, for behold, the days are coming, Jeremiah used the Hebrew phrase Yamin Baim, Y-A-M-I-M, oh, there it is, Baim, days are coming. Again, that expression now places these prophecies into the prophetic future, where it says, you know, behold, the days are coming, it's the prophetic future. This is the 6th time that this phrase has been used by Jeremiah. And again, it puts it into the prophetic future. And it's going to be that I will bring back from captivity my people, Israel and Judah. So at that time, Jehovah would restore, that word is shuv, it's one of Jeremiah's favorite words. He'll restore the fortunes of his people and bring them back, again, shuv, the land of their forefathers. So Jeremiah uses his favorite word here several times. God will cause them to return to the land that he gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. This is in a distant future. And verses 1 to 3 in this section here, God is spelling out for Jeremiah's sake a segment which will give him consolation. Verse 3 is a basic summary of the entire content of chapters 30 to 33. The summary is that God will turn again the captivity of his people. It includes both houses of Israel, and both Israel and Judah. Remember, Judah, southern kingdom, Israel, northern kingdom, separated after the death of King Solomon. So both Judah and Israel are singularly God's people, and he will give them the land of their fathers, and the day is coming when they shall possess it. That's the summary, and the rest of chapter 30 to 33 adds the details to it. So we have the time of Jacob's trouble, which we're going to see in verses 4 to 11. Although these verses don't begin on a positive note because they deal with the time of Jacob's trouble, which is a term for the Great Tribulation, yet these words are necessary because the final restoration of Israel is preceded by the Great Tribulation. And for that reason, Jeremiah must deal with this difficult time as well. He must speak about it. And in verse 4, he introduces the next section. And these are the words that Jehovah spoke concerning Israel and concerning Judah. So what he's about to say concerns both houses of Israel, Judah and Israel. And in verses 5 to 7, he now describes the Great Tribulation itself. In verse 5, he announces the voice of judgment. For thus says Jehovah, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. So the people have heard a voice of trembling, a voice of fear, but there was no peace amongst it. It's not the peace one might expect when dealing with words of comfort in the final restoration. Instead of peace, what we have is terror and panic during the tribulation period. In verse 6, Jeremiah uses a figure that is commonly used by the prophets of the Old Testament. It's the figure of the travailing woman, the woman in travail. The term travail literally means birth pains or birth pangs. It refers to the series of birth pains that a woman undergoes before giving birth to a baby. The last days of the church age, where we're in the church age now, the last days of the church age and the events of the Great Tribulation are always viewed in Scripture as a series of birth pains before the birth of the new age, which is the Messianic age or the millennial age. Now, Jeremiah brings in the figure of travail here, and he asks a rhetorical question. Ask ye now and see whether a man does travail with child. So can a man give birth? Is what he's asking. Can a man give birth? And this is a rhetorical question, right? And it demands a negative answer. No, men do not travail with child. They can't give birth to a child. Women undergo birth pains. Men do not give birth to babies, only women do so. If that is true, then Jeremiah asks another question. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness? Since men cannot bear children, how come these men are behaving like women in labor and their faces have turned pale? Good reason for it. Verse 7 provides the answer to that question. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Now, Hebrew term for great is gadol. It refers to greatness in magnitude or extent or intensity, in sound, in age or importance. So Jeremiah noted that that day is going to be a unique day, for no other time had ever been like it. Now, elsewhere in Scripture, it is referred to as the day of Jehovah or the day of the Lord. And without exception, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, these expressions always refer to the tribulation. Jeremiah declared that this day would be the time of Jacob's trouble. The tribulation is going to fall upon all humanity, and the whole world will suffer greatly because of it. However, the judgments of the tribulation will have a particular effect upon the Jewish people. One of the purposes of that 7-year period is to judge the world for sin and to make an end to wickedness and wicked ones. You can have a look at that in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 6 to 16, Isaiah 13, 6 to 16, and Isaiah 24, 19 to 20. Isaiah 24, 19 to 20. So, first purpose, to make an end of wickedness and the wicked one. Second purpose is to bring Israel to national repentance. And this goal will be achieved by means of the tribulation judgments. So while it is true that tribulation will fall upon all humanity, it will not fall upon all equally, for it will be far more severe for the Jewish people. And this truth is based upon a principle that is found in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 2. Isaiah 40, 1 to 2 says this: comfort ye, my people, says your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received of Jehovah's hand double for all her sins. Because of Israel's unique covenantal relationship with God, Israel has always received double punishment for her sins. So, indeed, no time will be like this day of Jehovah, this time of Jacob's trouble. for it's going to be a unique day, a unique time for the Jewish people. Now, like Jeremiah, Jesus also described the tribulation as a unique time of suffering, speaking of great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And he speaks about this in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 28, and Revelation 12, verses 1 to 17. He pointed out that there shall be great tribulation, such as has not been, nor ever shall be, from the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall be. So it's a very unique period of time. When the great tribulation hits, it'll be the worst period in all of human history. It will be the worst time for the Jews that has ever been throughout Jewish history. The tribulation will be worse than any other anti-Semitic campaign that they have previously suffered, worse than the Crusades, the pogroms, and the Holocaust. After this dreadful pronouncement of judgment, verse 7 concludes with a message of hope, a promise, in fact, that the Jewish people will be saved out of the tribulation. Now, according to Zechariah 13, verses 8 to 9, 2/3 of the Jewish population of that future time will lose their lives. Consequently, the promise is that 1/3 of the Jewish population will survive the Great Tribulation. Now, in chapters 30 to 33, Jeremiah makes several references to this particular day, and he uses various expressions. And one of these expressions is the days are coming. Now, this may include the tribulation period, and it may also include the kingdom period. We'll see the days are coming in Jeremiah 31, 27, 31, and 38. Another expression is the day comes. This is Jeremiah 33, 14. Another expression is in those days, Jeremiah 31, 29, 33, 16. We have a fourth title he uses for the day of Jehovah's trouble is at that time. This is found in Jeremiah 31, 1, 33, 15. And he also uses after those days, Jeremiah 31, 33. So Jeremiah 30, verses 4 to 7, if we just summarize it, brings out the uniqueness of the tribulation in relation to Israel. While the scriptures have many names for the tribulation, this particular passage here gives it a name that directly relates the period to the Jewish nation. It is a time of Jacob's trouble, the time of Israel's trouble. The entire world will suffer during the tribulation, but Israel will suffer far more. The basic reason for this truth lies in her relationship with God. Because Israel is God's firstborn, we can see this back in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, she receives double, both in blessing and cursing. And this principle is the reason why the tribulation is uniquely the time of Jacob's trouble. Now in verses 8 to 11, he now elaborates upon the Jewish deliverance from the tribulation introduced in the last phrase of verse 7. But he shall be saved out of it. That's Jacob, Israel. In verse 8, there'll be the breaking of the oppressor's yoke on that day. It shall come to pass in that day, says Jehovah of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off your neck and will burst your bonds, and strangers shall no more make him their bondman. So this verse promises that in that day, meaning in the tribulation, Jehovah himself will intervene and remove a certain yoke from the necks of his people. The personal pronoun his refers to the Antichrist. His yoke, the Antichrist yoke. And the Antichrist will actually be the king of Babylon at that time. Jehovah also promised that he would tear off the bonds of his people, meaning that Israel would now be freed. And this freeing will occur at the end of the tribulation. And from then on, never again will foreigners conquer and subjugate Israel. Rather, what's going to happen in verse 9? But they shall serve Jehovah their God and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. So in place of serving human conquerors, It is God whom they will serve in that future time. Jehovah will be their God. David will be their king. Now, this is the literal David. It will not be David's greatest son, Jesus, although Jesus will clearly rule in the kingdom. There is no reason in this passage to take the name David as being anything but literal. David will be a co-regent with Jesus the Messiah. Jesus will reign over the entire world. The church will be co-reigning with Christ over the Gentile nations. King David will be the prince over Israel. He will co-reign with Jesus over the nation of Israel. And clearly, Jeremiah refers to the resurrected David and not Jesus, because he says, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. Now, the term raise up is the word cum, K-U-M. That is often used in the sense of being raised or resurrected from the dead. So King David will be resurrected from the dead during the 75-day interval between the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the Messianic kingdom, and he will reign over Israel. Now, it's not only taught here, this fact not only taught here, but we see it in three other places where we're taught that King David will be co-regent with Messiah Jesus in his rule over Israel. Ezekiel 34, verses 23 to 24, Ezekiel 37, verses 24 to 25, and Hosea 3, verse 5. So King David will reign as a co-regent with Jesus over the 12 tribes of Israel. Now in verse 10, he points out that for that reason, Israel is not to fear. Therefore, considering these various promises that we see in verses 8 to 10, in verse 10, we now read, therefore, fear thou not, O Jacob, my servant, says Jehovah, neither be dismayed, O Israel. So what he's saying is, Israel shouldn't fear. No matter how bad it might become, Israel as a nation will always survive. Now, in the second part of verse 10 and verse 11, he gives the reasons why Israel should not fear. First of all, Israel will be regathered in verse 10. For lo, I will save you from afar, and your seed from the land of their captivity, and Jacob shall return. Again, we see the word shuv, S-H-U-V, used here. Jacob shall have rest and be quiet, and no one shall make him afraid. So the first reason they shouldn't fear is that Israel will be regathered. Second, Israel will survive in verse 11. For I am with you, says Jehovah, to save you, for I will make a full end of all the nations whither I have scattered you, but I will not make a full end of you. So while there are going to be Gentile nations who will cease to exist prior to the kingdom, Israel should not worry. While God will make a full end of the nations where the Jews have been scattered, the guarantee is that he will never make a full end of Israel. While portions of Israel may be lost due to war or persecution, the nation can never be totally annihilated. Rather, he says in verse 11, but I will correct you in measure and will in no wise leave you unpunished. Now, Israel is a sinful nation. Her greatest sin was the rejection of the messiahship of Jesus. Punishment must come in the tribulation. And this punishment of the great tribulation must come because of her failure under the Mosaic law, but it also must come specifically because of the rejection of the messiahship of Jesus. Yet God will correct Israel in measure. There will be a limit to God's punishment for Israel. While Israel will not be unpunished, in fact, we've seen Israel will be more punished than the Gentiles. Yet she will never be totally done away with or annihilated, no matter how hard the world tries. Now, in verses 12 to 17, we see the healing of Zion's wounds. 12 to 15, he deals with the wounding of Zion. In verse 12, he describes the sick state of Israel. For thus says Jehovah, thy hurt is incurable, and your wound grievous. From a human point of view, Israel has reached a fatal point from which there is no return to life. But that is only from a human perspective. In verse 13, he portrays their picture even more darkly. There is no one to plead your cause that you may be bound up. You have no healing medicines. Hebrew noun here for healing, talah, refers to the forming of skin over a wound. So the healing he's talking about is the new flesh which grows over an old wound. It's the forming of the skin over the healing. The skin forms over the wound. The problem with Israel here is that the wound is incurable and grievous. In other words, it was so bad that new skin could not grow over the wound. It was so bad. And then in verses 14 to 15, he points out that God is the one who did the wounding. All your lovers have forgotten you. They do not seek you. The other nations have been Israel's lovers in the sense that Israel worshipped their gods. Yet although she had turned her back on her own God, these nations would turn their backs on Israel. These other nations no longer seek after Israel. The reason they abandoned Israel is because God has wounded her with the wound of an enemy. He chastised her with the chastisement of a cruel one. When the nations around Israel saw the type of punishment that God inflicted upon Israel, their desire for her suddenly ceased. Israel found herself alone. And the second part of verse 14 points out the reasons for the wounding. For I have wounded you with the wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one, for the greatness of your iniquity. The reason for the wounding is given in the third part of verse 14, because your sins were increased. So first, because of the greatness of her iniquity, and second, because her sins were increased. That's why she has been wounded so terribly. Now, verse 15, the first part gives us God's question to his people. Why cry you for your hurt? Why was Israel crying out in the sense of seeking aid from others? According to the second part of verse 15, nothing would ease her pain. God says, your pain is incurable. And then in the third part of verse 15, God provided two reasons for punishing Israel in such a severe way. For the greatness of your iniquity, because your sins were increased, I have done these things unto you. Now, there's a bit of an interplay here between the singular and the plural in this and the previous verse. God's punishment was the result of Israel's iniquity, which was singular, and sins, which are plural. The singular iniquity is very specific. And in the overall context of the scriptures, it refers to Israel's national rejection of the messiahship of Jesus. If you want to write these down, Leviticus 26, verse 40 to 42, Leviticus 26, 40 to 42, Jeremiah 3, 11 to 18, Jeremiah 3, 11 to 18, Zechariah 12, verse 10, Zechariah 12, 10, Hosea 5, 15, Hosea 5, 15, and Matthew 23, 37 to 39, where this refers to their singular iniquity. The nation's sins were increased. So we have their iniquity, which was singular, which refers to the rejection of the messiahship of Jesus. And then we have the nation's sins, right, which were increased. Why? Why were they increased? Well, because the people did not have the means of atonement. Remember, no temple, no sacrifice, no atonement. For the past 2,000 years, most Jews have not recognized Jesus as the atoning sacrifice for their sins. However, with the death of Messiah, God ceased to accept animal sacrifices, and the Jewish people had no means of atonement. So as they sinned, the total of Israel's transgressions simply grew and grew. That's why it says your sins were increased. They've increased to the point where there's this massive bundle of sins just waiting there to be taken away, forgiven. So after dealing with the wounding in verses 12 to 15, he goes on to deal with the healing in verses 16 to 17. After all, he has promised that Jacob will be saved out of it. In verse 16, therefore, all they that devour you shall be devoured, and all your adversaries, every one of them, shall go into captivity. And they that despoil you shall be a spoil, and all they that prey upon you will I give for a prey. So God will punish the Gentile nations. The nations that inflicted judgment upon Israel will now suffer judgment themselves, and those who devoured Israel shall be devoured. All her adversaries, every one of them without exception, shall go into captivity. Those who plundered Israel will be plundered. Those who preyed upon Israel, God will make a prey. If you just cast your mind back to the Abrahamic covenant, where God says in Genesis 12:3, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you. It's curse for curse in kind. So you prey upon Israel, you're going to be made a prey yourself. You plundered Israel, you're going to be plundered yourself. So in the healing process now, there'll be two basic steps. First of all, God will punish the nations who inflicted harshness upon Israel in verse 16. The second step, the actual recovery of Israel, is now spelled out in verses 17 or in verse 17. For I will restore health unto you, and I will heal you of your wounds, says Jehovah, because they have called you an outcast, saying, it is Zion, whom no man seeks after. The reason God will do this is because of the statements Israel's enemies have made. The statements of Israel's enemies are, first of all, they have called Israel an outcast. Second, they have said, this Zion, whom no one seeks after. God will soon prove the statements of these Gentile enemy nations wrong. And in verses 18 to 22, God now deals further with the theme of the restoration of Israel. Verse 18 begins with a statement dealing with the return. Thus says Jehovah, behold, I will turn again the captivity of Jacob's tents, and have compassion on his dwelling places, and the city shall be built upon its own hill, and the palace shall be inhabited after its own manner. Again, we see Jeremiah using the word shuv, turn again. When he mentions the expression Jacob's tents, well, what's this mean? Well, this emphasizes temporary dwellings versus permanent dwellings. It emphasizes temporary houses or abodes versus permanent homes or dwellings. So the picture here is one of Israel living in temporary abodes, in tents, at the time of their final regathering. Now, from Matthew 24:15 to 28 and Revelation 12:1 to 17, it's clear that during the tribulation judgment, Israel will be scattered from their land totally. Those who survive will flee to the wilderness area known as Petra or Bozrah. That's in southern Jordan. They'll dwell there, away from their permanent residence, in temporary abodes, in tents. And God will save Jacob while they are still living in temporary abodes. A similar statement to this is made in Zechariah 12, verse 7. Zechariah 12, verse 7. The time and place of rescue are stated in Micah chapter 2, verse 12. I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of you. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together as the sheep of Bozrah, as a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make great noise by reason of the multitude of men. Now, God goes on to say that he'll have compassion on Jacob's dwellings. Well, sorry, Micah 2:12 just tells us the place is Bozrah, where he will gather the remnant of Israel. Bozrah, southern Jordan. Petra is the name that we know it as today, the Greek name. Okay. God then further goes on to say that he'll have compassion on Jacob's dwelling places. So this is a reference to the land of Israel itself. No longer the tents, but back into the land. God will rescue Jacob from the place where he's dwelling temporarily, which is away from the land of Israel. Then God will have compassion upon the land itself. The city will be rebuilt upon its own hill. Now, the word city in the Hebrew text does not have the definite article, so it is not the city. It should be taken as a collective singular for all the cities of the promised land. So all the cities of the promised land will be built upon its own hill. And the word for hill is the word tel, T-E-L, tel, T-E-L. Now, tel is a word that deals with a man-made mound on which are the ruins of a city. So the cities are going to be rebuilt upon their same ancient sites. So where they dig up a city and discover an ancient site, they'll rebuild the city upon the same site. And this term tel is used in this same sense in 2 Kings 19 verse 12, 2 Kings 19:12, Ezra 2 verse 59, and Ezra 2:59, and Ezekiel 3 verse 15. Each city will be rebuilt upon its own ruins, and the palace, he goes on to say here, will be inhabited after its own manner. In verse 19, he spells out the effects upon the people of Israel. And out of them shall proceed thanksgiving and the voice of them that make merry, and I'll multiply them, and they shall not be few. I'll also glorify them, and they shall not be small. So first of all, they're going to give thanksgiving. Second, they're going to make merry. Third, they're going to increase numerically. God promises to multiply them, and they'll not be few, even though this was true in the past, not going to be true in the future. Fourth, they shall be glorified. No longer shall they be small. No longer will they be counted unworthy among the nations. In verse 20, he spells out their establishment. Their children also shall be as aforetime. Aforetime. Now, this aforetime includes the period of the Exodus and the time of the monarchy. Their congregation shall be established before me, and I will punish all who oppress them. So again, he brings out the two aspects of Israel's healing. First, on the one hand, it includes the punishment of the Gentile nations. Second, on the other hand, it includes the saving of Israel. Verse 21, he talks about their new leaders. And their prince shall be of themselves, and their ruler shall proceed from the midst of them. So the new leaders will be Jewish and not Gentiles. And he emphasizes their Jewishness here. Their prince shall be from among them. The prince shall arise from the Jewish people. Hebrew word for prince here is Adir, I-double-D-I-R, I-double-D-I-R, and refers to noble ones of noble birth. Now, based upon this verse, this Hebrew word Adir has been taken by the rabbis as a messianic title. And many rabbinic writings place this as a messianic verse. Also, once again, his Jewishness is emphasized. Not only will the leaders be Jewish, but also God will cause them to be rightly related to himself. And I'll cause him to draw near, and he shall approach unto me. For who is he that has boldness? Who is he that has had boldness to approach unto me, says Jehovah. Only one person has that type of boldness, and that is the Messiah himself, as mentioned earlier. This verse has been taken by the rabbis as a messianic verse. The term Adir as one of the titles of the Messiah. Verse 22 shows the results of Messiah's reign, and you shall be my people, and I shall be your God. Once again, in the future, Jehovah would be the God of Israel. And the reason is that Israel would be regenerated as a saved nation. She would now be under a righteous ruler, the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach. And that ends our study for this session. Study hard, grow strong. Thank you for coming along.